Hmm. So welcome. My name's Alan Levin, and this is the second in a series of podcasts, interviews that I'm doing on the theme of crossing boundaries. And today I'm actually very happy to be talking with a friend, Naftuli Moster, who is the founder and executive director of Young Advocates for Fair Education. The acronym is Yaffed, an advocacy organization dedicated to ensuring that students at Hasidic yeshivas in New York City and all over, I would imagine, receive a complete general education as defined by law. Moster was named in 2015 as one of the Forward 50, offered by Forward magazine, a Jewish publication, in recognition of the impact on Jewish social activism and leadership. Naftuli grew up in Borough Park, Brooklyn, one of 17 children in a Yiddish-speaking Hasidic family. He eventually earned a Master of Social Work degree at Hunter College in 2015. His education, which we will definitely be talking about as his primary focus now is education, in his yeshiva focused mostly on religious studies, causing him several challenges applying for and studying at college. One more thing, since 2012, Yaffed has been the sole organization advocating for the educational rights of ultra-Orthodox children in New York. So that brings up a question I wanted to ask you, Naftuli. In what I just read, it mentions Haredi, Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox. What is the correct or best term to refer to the community in which you grew up?
So it's a good question, and I always like to inform the audience about this as much as possible. So the Jewish spectrum is pretty wide, right? Going from totally secular Jews, Reform, Conservative, Modern Orthodox, and then ultra-Orthodox. So under the ultra-Orthodox umbrella, there are two main groups. One is called the Litvish people, Litvish community. They're often also referred to as yeshivish or black hat, right? As wearing a black hat. Then to the right of them, you have the Hasidic community. And
when you say right, what do you mean by right?
I literally mean somewhat more conservative, more observant, and so forth. So you have the Hasidic community, which is in itself subdivided into dozens of smaller sects, okay? There are approximately about a dozen large Hasidic sects that have thousands or even tens of thousands of adherents or families. And then you have smaller ones that often have like a few dozen or 100 or none, but they're still kind of like these little sects. So I grew up, so when you say you grew up Hasidic, which I grew up Hasidic, you grew up Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox, because the Hasidic community is under the ultra-Orthodox banner and umbrella. So yeah, I grew up in the Belz Hasidic sect, and it's headquartered in Jerusalem, but they have kind of branches or outposts in different parts of the world, mainly, London, Belgium, Canada, and the US. So I grew up in Borough Park. It's a very Hasidic neighborhood, and attended Belz Hasidic yeshivas my entire life. That's another feature that a lot of people don't realize, is that in the Hasidic community, if you belong to a certain sect, you go to the yeshiva and the institutions of that sect. There's not a lot of, options or crossover. You belong in that sect, you pray at their synagogues, the boys go to the boys' yeshiva, the girls go to the girls' school, and you generally stay within that community. So that's how I grew up.
Okay, and the term Haredi or Haredim, is that refer to all the ultra-Orthodox groups?
I'm sorry, yes, you're right. The Haredi, a Haredi person, or the Haredim, as the group is often referred to, is basically another term for ultra-Orthodoxy. It's more commonly used in Israel, because Haredi is a Hebrew word. But, there's a little bit of a push to just use it instead of the word ultra-Orthodox.
Okay, so within your community, of course, you had a family. And I'd like to focus a little bit on and ask you if you could describe what your childhood was like. I'm thinking of, before you were 10 years old, you lived with, uh, I take it, in a home with mother, father, and many siblings. What was that like? What do you remember? Was it a fun time for you, a difficult time? Was the strictness of the rules a difficult thing? Tell
So
us something.
it's a combination. There were good and bad, um, you know, easy and difficult. But basically, yes, I grew up in a one family home. We were a big family, so you can imagine we needed the whole house to ourselves. Um, the truth is, when I was, let's say, you asked before I was 10, at that point, my family wasn't complete because my mother continued having kids till I don't know, probably till I was 14 or 15. So I'm the middle child of 17 kids. Okay, so my first seven siblings, my oldest seven siblings are boys, straight boys. And then comes a girl, and then myself.
Hmm.
And then come twins, and two other girls, two boys, a girl, and another boy. So yeah, so the boys tend to be a lot more, the boys tend to get, focused more on Jewish studies, almost exclusively. And at some point, especially in my sect, they would take off to Israel to because in the Hasidic, in some Hasidic sects, beyond high school, you continue on in yeshiva. It's called yeshiva gedola, which means in Hebrew the large yeshiva. And in my Hasidic sect, they only had that in Israel. So even if you lived in the U.S. or Canada, London, everyone would fly to Israel for a few years and study there. So interestingly, I actually didn't know some of my oldest brothers very well. They would come home once a year for Passover, and they would genuinely feel like strangers. I remember, like, as a kid, there's this custom to shake hands, right? It's even more common in the Orthodox world when someone comes back from a trip, right? You shake hands and you say Shalom Aleichem. Um, and I remember the awkwardness around it. It just felt like they were strangers in many ways. And then they would take off, right? They would come home for Passover or occasionally for a wedding in the family, and then they would go back to Israel. And again, I wouldn't see them for months upon months, or sometimes a whole year. So there was that component of it. And then I grew up kind of like with the girl cohort in my family because, as I said, there was one older girl above me, and then right beneath me there are twin girls and two other girls. So I grew up kind of like in that part of the family. Um, there were parts that were nice. Having lots of kids all the time. I mean, I didn't know it any differently. So, but I could see, especially during a pandemic, let's say for my own son, especially while he was the only child, that it was difficult, to just be alone, um, especially when you can't interact with friends. But so there are positives, and then of course there are the stresses that come with it. The parents, and this is not just true for my own parents, you can't really raise 17 kids or even 12 kids. I know this because I have a hard time raising two kids. Okay. And I know from my friends, it's just hard, especially if you want to do it right. So what ends up happening is that the system, in large part the yeshiva system, the school system over there, it assumes the role of really raising the kids, which is why in the Hasidic yeshiva system, boys spend almost every waking moment in yeshiva, especially once they enter high school. Even younger boys spend almost their entire day in yeshiva. This is not like public school. They don't leave at 2:42. They leave usually at either 5:30 or 7 p.m. That's even before they reach high school. Okay. And then the second part is that the older siblings end up raising the younger siblings.
Yeah.
And older kids, and by that I mean like the 10-year-old raising the 5-year-old, it's just not exactly that good. So there's a lot of, being dropped unintentionally, a lot of being, kicked intentionally and things like that. So yeah, it was a mix.
there are images that one sees of the Hasidic world in movies and so forth, where there's a sometimes there's a very austere and strict uh, aura around the parents and grandparents and different things. Was that something, were your parents, did you find you were able to be close and warm with your parents, or was there a distance that you think maybe isn't so true in the way that you raise your children now?
I mean, in my family in particular, we were somewhat close to my mother, somewhat distant from my father. I thought it was unique to my family, but I'm learning that it is a common feature. And yes, it's like in these families, you know, I don't know if you know this, but the Jews have, you know, we have like a bunch of mitzvahs, a bunch of, you know, requirements, religious requirements, but there are the 10 commandments that are most important. And that's always drilled into us from a very young age, that you must respect your father and your mother.
Mm.
So, and everything in the family and in the community kind of like reinforces that, mostly the father. So, you know, the father always sits at the head table, and you're not supposed to even sit on his chair, even when he's not around. You're not supposed to sit on his chair or at his seat. Um, so those kinds of things do reinforce this kind of sense of like, you know, they're all the way high up there, you know. Um, but so yeah, I mean, there was that sense, and then grandparents also were largely, especially, you know, there were some of them were Holocaust survivors, and so there was definitely a lot of respect, not because they were Holocaust survivors, but I'm just adding that too. But there was a lot of respect towards the elderly. That's definitely a common feature.
Mhm. Do you remember having any contact at all or awareness at all of the world outside of the community that you were growing up in, and any feelings toward, I mean, did you run into in the playgrounds or in the streets or places kids that, you know, obviously look different and either by skin color or just dress or the way they behaved? And was there any feeling towards them as what their relationship was to you?
That's a good question. We actually, I lived around the corner from my yeshiva, and my yeshiva was diagonally across the street from my public school in
Mm.
the heart of Borough Park. At the time, it made a little more sense because Borough Park was still filling in with Hasidic Jews. Now it's kind of like just there, and most of the kids attending the public school come from outside of Borough Park, and it's not the only public school. So it's a strange dynamic. But what I'm trying to tell you is, we lived across the street. We studied across the street from them, but we had zero engagement or even zero exposure to them. And I think it was so by design. And so any sense of like, you know, look, I as a kid, I hardly ever left Borough Park, right? If anything, we would go from, let's say, one insular community to another. Right? Let's say we would go to a wedding in Muncie, get in a car, go to Muncie, go to the wedding, come back to our own little, you know, community. I lived 2 blocks away from an F train. Okay, you know, anyone who knows the New York City subway, an F train, you get onto it, a few minutes later, you could be in the city. The first time I ever set foot on any train in my entire life was when I was 19 or 20. So, and similarly with even with a local city bus, right? So there's a lot of disconnect. Even, you know, it's like I call them these invisible borders or boundaries,
That's
where
what
it's
I was
just like
going to ask you.
you just don't go beyond it. You know, this is where the Yidden live, the Jews, and that's where the Goyim live, the Gentiles, right?
Right.
And you just we would stay in there, and we would also think of the outside as scary, so that was another reason we would avoid it. But the point is, yeah, we did not have any exposure, and the little exposure would be negative. So, for instance, if we would ever cause trouble in our yeshiva, um, which would hardly ever happen during Jewish studies. Secular studies, it was basically free for all. but oftentimes they would say, you see that police car parked outside the public school across the street? Do we need police in our yeshiva? Like that's how you're behaving, like these animals, they would call it that, across the street. Now, the irony is, the police was there for security. Nowadays, most yeshivas have a security guard too, funded by the city. So it was just putting down the non-Jews or the outside world in multiple different ways.
Thank you. Do you remember, you must have seen, of course, the older people praying and doing the various rituals that are part of Judaism. Did that ever seem to you as a child to bring about in you a feeling of religion, of religious fervor, or what was your sense of the word God, or how was it referred, Hashem, and
Yeah,
so
we don't.
forth?
Yeah, we wouldn't call it God, to be honest. We would call it Hashem.
Right, it's Hebrew.
Yeah, or there's a Yiddish word, the Eibishter, things like that. Um, I didn't have to look to the elder for how to, pray or how to, value it. We were taught this from a very young age. Unlike public schools or even most private schools, the first thing we would do when we got to yeshiva was pray. This was from a very young age, from like when we were 4. And then as we got older, it only became more intense, longer prayers and
What
things
I'm
like that.
looking for, Naftuli, is whether or not that actually meant anything to you, whether it actually felt like something, or something that you just learned to do, like your ABCs, or I
Oh,
remember we used to do the Pledge of Allegiance to, in secular schools,
I know.
and it didn't feel like I was loving my country or anything like that. It just felt like something I had to do, put my hand
Yeah,
up there.
but it's a very different ballgame because all day long it was drilled into us that God and prayer and study of the Torah are kind of like the ultimate goal and the best deed you can do. So whether it is that we had some sort of revelation, which I don't think any kids necessarily had, or it's just because you're fish in water and they tell you water is all you can swim in and drink and eat or whatever. So that's really what it was. I don't think we had an opportunity necessarily to explore it on our own, to find God, like to find Jesus or something. It's just drilled into you from a very young age. It's the air you breathe, literally. Everything else is an afterthought. I don't say that in an exaggeration. I mean it. If you walk into a yeshiva, any here in Rockland, you'll understand what I mean. This is all day long. The focus is on God, prayer, study of the Torah, more prayer. And, we would pray actually multiple times a day in very formal ways. And a lot of the sermons, the speeches were around, we must pray even more and pray with intention and understanding and so on and so forth. So it's like, I don't even know if there was another option, even if we wanted to.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'm getting my answer in the form of what it was that you were taught to do, and the actions that you were, and the words you were, required to say. And what I'm looking for is, like, I know people who tell me, I never had this experience as a kid, that when they went to a church or they went to a synagogue, some people, they would say that one or two times in their life when they were little kids, they had this feeling of a presence, of a kind of a spiritual feeling that went way beyond anything that they had ever come to understand or be told about. And often ritual, sort of puts a barrier between people and that kind of an experience. And I often wonder whether by having so much ritual and so much required things that you have to say, you never even get to the subjective feeling that that's supposed to bring about.
I don't know. And if I did, I wouldn't be able to recall it.
Yeah,
You know.
that's okay. So you went through, of course, the education process, which you have described very articulately and wonderfully in many interviews that you've done and in articles that you've written, which pretty much didn't have hardly any secular education, what we think of as secular education, math, science, history, and even English. So you didn't learn English hardly at all, is that right? It was almost like when I learned Spanish in high school, I could barely speak it.
Yes, yes, that sounds about right. And that is not just true for English, it's for all kinds of what we call secular studies. Well, we didn't call it, we didn't even know it. But like anything beyond Judaic studies, Torah, Talmud, Halacha, um, everything else was considered, secular. And we only learned basic English and arithmetic a few years in elementary and middle school for at the end of the school day, maximum of 90 minutes a day, and that was it. So yeah, we didn't learn any science or social studies, and yeah, even the English and arithmetic that we studied was taught um, kind of like trying to teach in the middle of recess, that kind of style, and it certainly didn't stick, especially since the rest of the school day and the rest of our days at home, none of it was reinforced, right? So even if we learned a few words of English, wasn't used anywhere else. And then once we reached high school, we got cut off completely from secular education. Our school days got even longer, so we would spend about 14 hours a day in yeshiva from 6:30 a.m. to 8:30 p.m., and we would study zero secular education. No, not even English or math. And of course, we wouldn't communicate in English. Our spoken language was Yiddish. So yeah, nothing, barely anything that we learned in terms of secular studies even stuck. But we didn't get much in the first place.
So when did you begin to question your relationship to the Hasidic world? I know there are some people who have written books about that, Shulam Dean's book, and you should probably familiar with, and the film Unorthodox, and a number of things. One of Us, uh, people who questioned their relationship to the Hasidic world. It seems to me like that would be a very dramatic, difficult process to go through, given what you've described as, sort of being drilled and inculcated with all of these associations that form your identity, and the fear of the what's on the other side of that boundary uh, that the community develops. When did it first start to occur in your mind that maybe this isn't for me?
It's a good question. I think it started when I was in yeshiva in Israel, as I mentioned before, and we basically spent almost the entire day in one big study hall room. And we were studying different things like Talmud and so forth. And then what I discovered was that the second half of the day, most of the boys were just like not interested in it anymore. We would just like, roam the hallways, drink coffee, smoke cigarettes. These are like 16 to 19-year olds. Um, and I was like, why are we not even trying to teach anything useful? We're all about to be married off at a young age, right? Because this is common in the Hasidic world to be married at 18 or 19. And I'm like, why not bring someone in to teach English or math? I didn't even know about science, but I'm like, just something useful, right? Because soon we're going to have to support ourselves and our families. And of course, and I actually mentioned it to some of my friends, and they laughed it off, like, yeah, like that's going to happen. Because again, they value religious studies too much to the exclusion of anything, what they deem secular. So that so when I came home, I began kind of like I developed this interest in pursuing an education. And at the time, I knew very little about what college is. The word college wouldn't be uttered by any of my teachers growing up. It's, let alone giving us actual college prep. That definitely didn't happen. Remember, in high school, we got zero secular education. So as you can imagine, there was zero college preparation. So I didn't know much, but I had this thirst for learning and for becoming something, outside of necessarily becoming a rabbi, which is the only thing I was being groomed to do until that point.
So this was just going on inside your own mind. You didn't discuss this with
In the
parents.
beginning, it was going on inside my own mind, but I did begin, bringing it up with some people. But pursuing a college degree prior to marriage, in the Hasidic world, even after marriage, is not common, but prior to marriage is definitely frowned upon. And but I wanted to do it, and suddenly it became this situation where I was becoming a rebel just by wanting to become a psychologist. And frankly, I wanted to become a psychologist because I wanted to help my community. There was so much mental illness that went undiagnosed and untreated in my community and in my own family. I thought I would be good at it, and even that I had to sneak around people. So suddenly I found myself kind of like being a rebel in a very strange way, right? You think of like teens at risk doing drugs and all that, and here I am sneaking into college. And I don't mean that in an exaggeration. I would literally sneak in. This was an Orthodox college located in Borough Park, and I would like look over my shoulder as I would slip into the door, right? So I think that kind of
Because
like,
this was a modern Orthodox. It wasn't
it's
part of the Hasidic world.
well, I would say it's catering more to modern Orthodox and to the Litvish. You remember the left side of the ultra-Orthodox spectrum. I stood out there like as a thorn. Okay, me and the handful of other Hasidic people. It's segregated men and women. So the few other men, from Hasidic backgrounds, but I was one of the bad, like the real worst ones. But there were some others who came like from Williamsburg. Williamsburg is considered more insular than even Borough Park, so maybe they were a little worse in terms of the lack of knowledge and the ability to speak in English. But anyway, I think that experience kind of set me a little bit on a path toward rebellion and more importantly, toward questioning the wisdom of our leaders and my own parents. You know what I mean? I think that would be like one of the first steps.
At that stage, you weren't necessarily thinking of leaving the community, as much as just living your life a little differently than
No,
the
not even living
authority,
my life any differently.
but
Just
staying in the
yeah,
ultra-Orthodox
very
fold.
much. Yeah.
So how did that evolve? Was it very emotionally difficult to begin to question even living within the community?
Of course. Again, as I described, and I think you picked up on it, the level of insularity is so intense.
Mhm.
It's so intense. Your mind is conditioned to never go beyond a certain place, right? So questioning, oftentimes we hear like, oh, Jews are all about questioning. That's just not true for the ultra-Orthodox, certainly not for the Hasidic world. The only times we question is the 4 questions that we ask on Passover Eve. Other than that, you're not supposed to question. Literally, you're not supposed to question. And even bringing yourself to question is just such a big hurdle to get over. Like the idea that our leaders could be wrong, right? Or could be self-serving. Oh my God, that is a big one. To be like, when I had the revelation that, you know, leaders can be flawed, parents can be flawed, can be self-serving, or even when they say that they have your best interest at heart, that they may not even realize that they're lying, right? That what they mean is they have the collective best interest at heart, or they have the family name best interest at heart, or really their own best interest, right? Or God's interest, right? So there's a lot of conflation, but they say they have your best interest. So being able to question that, or getting to that point, is a huge hurdle. And yes, definitely emotionally draining and grappling, and usually only allowing yourself to ask this question like in your own bedroom. I began sneaking in books, and like one of the books that I snuck in was, I can't remember to this day if it was The Idiot's Guide to Geography or Geography for Dummies, but one of those. And why? What happened was, when I was about 21, I was at a Shabbos table with a few less not Hasidic people, or more modern Hasidic people, and I remember the topic of directions like north, south, west, and east came up, and I genuinely didn't know what's what. Okay, I'm 21 and I don't know which direction is what. And it was just so, that was like also like a big eye opener. I'm like, this is humiliating and it's unnecessary. So I went and I took out this book, and I expected to see a lot of maps, right? I was like, in addition to knowing the four directions, I'm going to learn where the states and the capitals and whatever is. And what was amazing is that I learned so much more than that. You don't just learn maps. When you see a map of, let's say, South Africa, you learn about the people, about the religions they worship. You learn about the agriculture. You learn, and you learn about their leaders. And what was interesting is, like, that's a specific example. I remember reading about their warlords. There's so, suddenly I was like, oh my God, we have warlords too. It's like the same thing, they believe that they claim that they have a connection to God, and a few things that I remember like was like resembling, and it gave me like a new realization that, you know what, we're just another tribe, like many others. We're not necessarily special, and we're not necessarily right, the correct ones, and
Or
we're
chosen.
just we're just one of, exactly, the chosen and all that stuff. We're one of many. So that was a big realization as
Mm,
well.
mm.
And other books too. I until that point, for instance, I had never done a day of exercise in my life. We didn't do. People forget what schooling involves, right? It includes sports and physical ed. We didn't do any of that, right? So I remember sneaking in books, also like just to do physical exercise and to learn about my body for the first time. For the first time, hearing the word or reading the word biceps. I couldn't read most of the words in the book, of course, because I could barely read or speak English. But basically, those things kind of like opened me up a little bit to the world, and I discovered that I had been severely limited for
So this was when you were about 21, you said.
20,
So,
21.
so
Yeah,
you were still in the community, but really more deeply questioning and really starting to even look at books and things that
of course,
opened your
sneaking.
eyes to the world in a different way. And so how long did it take before
By the
you
way, sneaking out to the library too, which we weren't supposed to do. So I would sneak in there.
where
Um,
I forget in terms of time, did you have any access to the internet or
One of the reasons I went to the library was to get access to the internet. Um,
yeah,
but at some point during that time, I did enroll in college. So I had that, and they had a computer room with access to the internet.
yeah.
So I got to do some more research and so forth, as
Were
well.
people around you, your family and siblings aware of this change you were going through? And was there conflict that came about because of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, my parents did not approve of me going to college, because going to college could mean not only ruining my own reputation, which it definitely would. Again, marriages are arranged, and anything can be counted against you. Going to college is a big negative, a big minus, whatever you want to call it. It's a stain on your reputation, but it's not only a stain on my own reputation, but also on my family's. So therefore, yes, my parents didn't want me to go to college, and that was a big technical struggle because I was a dependent.
It's so inverse, the world outside. A
It's
stain
totally
on your
crazy.
reputation to go to college.
I know, it's
And the
crazy.
family, a shame on the
I
family.
know, I know. So on a technical level, I needed my father's tax documents to be able to qualify for financial aid. He refused to give it to me. I managed to get it anyway behind his back, and I did have to like forge a signature at some point. I don't remember the specific document. and then more emotional, my mother would come up to my room and knock on the door every day and beg me to drop out of college. And that, it was just like too dramatic. And again, she used the fact that, my older siblings won't be able, because I still had two older siblings who had to get engaged and married and so forth. So yeah, it was a big challenge. And then it's funny because a few years later, um, as I was transitioning a little bit more, my appearance looked less Hasidic. I was kind of like kicked out of my family's house, basically told to leave. I can't stay there because I would corrupt the other kids or whatever. Um, and then at some point, I remember I wanted to transfer from that Orthodox college, which is a branch of Toro, to Brooklyn College, which is a CUNY. And suddenly, my mother was like, why can't you just go to Toro College? I'm like, a few years ago, we had a whole battle about that, and so, so it's all about like trying to like, hold on as much as you can. But when I was kicked out, I ended up working in a warehouse. So all of this took me a long time. I ended up having to go to school very part-time and evening. But I stayed the course, and it just took me, I think, 6 or 7 years to finish college with a BA in psychology.
At some point, was there an actual severing of the ties to the community where you stopped wearing the same garb and I don't know, did your family disown you or anything like that, like some families have?
Yeah, and the thing is though that this owning doesn't happen as maybe dramatically as you see it in the movies, but it happens. So like I told you before, I was very strongly told I must leave the house.
Mm.
Was it like, pulling out a gun on me as you see in the mini series, is it Unorthodox or something? No, but I couldn't stay there. That's a fact. And so at first they were so kind to put me up in a basement apartment, like right out on the outskirts of the community. It was the basement of my brother, and it was moldy and extremely tiny, and I had to leave. So it was basically, that was their way. They got me out of the house, put me into this untenable situation, then I had to leave. And I was really at the mercy of people. For a while, I actually lived in my car. For a few days, I lived in a rented car with most of my possessions, until someone put me up in a dorm somewhere with a bunch of immigrants who come here for English immersion. They come to the US. And it was interesting. So I lived with them for a few months. And what was interesting is these immigrants from Spain, the Czech Republic, and other places, they knew more about the US culture than I did.
Mm.
And it was just like shocking to them when they were like, you don't know who Elvis Presley is? You don't know who the Beatles were? And things like that. And it was just like constant, where I realized, like, holy moly, the it's not just a lack of formal education. It's also about, you know, the education you would normally get outside the classroom too. That was totally, absent.
Culture.
Yeah.
And and there are now, I know, and I guess they've been around for a little while, groups like Footsteps and people who do therapy with people who are leaving the community. Did you get involved with any of that? Did you have any need for that or feel it would have benefited?
Yes. Oh, of course. Absolutely. First of all, let me take a step back. As I was kind of changing a little bit, my mother actually offered to send me to a social worker. And this would be my first time in my entire life that I ever met with a mental health professional at the age of like 21 or 2, I don't remember. And and I said to her, that would be great, but keep in mind, it's not going to change my trajectory in terms of like coming back, right? You're sending me because, so that I can resolve any issues or have someone to talk to and stuff. But if your sole expectation is I'm going to come back as a result, then let's not do it. And she's like, no, totally, don't worry, Anyway, I went there. I think we did 3 sessions, and it didn't help in terms of coming back. So she cut me off.
But
So
that person was oriented that way, sort of like to bring you back
I
rather
don't know.
than
It was a
help
very
you transition out. Like Footsteps is more there to help people
I
that.
was going to get to Footsteps. I just figured I'll throw in this anecdote. But what's interesting was he was an Orthodox guy. Very strange situation. He was an Orthodox guy, ultra-Orthodox, I think, but he was blind. So he had a seeing eye dog. Very, very strange. I mean, just in general, there aren't a lot of ultra-Orthodox social workers, like real social workers. Second, there aren't a lot of blind social workers. So this was like really interesting. And what was interesting is at the time, one of my biggest issues, if I had any, was social anxiety. I mean, I'm calling it this now. At the time, I didn't even understand what it means. But I had social anxiety. I would blush a lot as a kid and adolescent and even young adult for anything. Even just thinking someone might be looking in my direction caused me to like blush and to have some sort of anxiety. And what was strange, what was interesting was having a blind therapist. He can't see me blush. Like it took away a little bit of the fear, right? It was a very interesting dynamic. But anyway, like I said, it lasted very briefly. But yeah, I actually did get support from Footsteps. In fact, they're the ones who helped me get that dorm where I got to stay for a few months while I was getting on my feet. They then tried to help me get a job. Ultimately, I ended up getting a job.
Just let me interrupt you for a second and just maybe quickly clarify what Footsteps is for people who don't. I wrote
Yeah,
it up, but
yeah. So Footsteps is a social service organization that helps people who choose to leave the community and basically helps them on their journey. And it could be, for some of them, it could mean going completely, leaving the community completely. Others could mean just discovering themselves in different ways. Like it could mean becoming differently religious or not. It's really about directed by the person, whatever the person wants. They don't do proselytizing. They don't go and try to, pull people out of the community. In fact, it's not even that easy to find them. So yeah, that's basically what it is. And yeah, they provided some.
they were helpful to you.
Yes, exactly. And they provide scholarships, college scholarships, which I think is probably their best service at the moment.
You remember where there was a moment where you actually sort of said to yourself in terms of your identity, of course, when you were growing up, you would have said, I am a Hasidic Jew. I'm a Hasidic Jew. And I don't think you would say that about yourself now. You would say you're a Jew. I don't, or what? What would you call
Yeah,
your,
it's confusing because here's the thing. Why is it that within the Hasidic world, if you change your appearance, um, you can be so easily shunned? Like I always say, look, there was a period of time where I accepted this label that was put on me from outside that I left the community. Or there's a derogatory term that ultra-Orthodox people use, people going off the derech. Derech in Hebrew means path, and they say, you've basically gone off the deep end, you've gone off the path.
is there an acronym for that?
An acronym is OTD, yes. And what happened is many people who kind of went OTD have accepted the term. In my opinion, it's because of the lack of a better term. So they've accepted it and kind of like proud. Yes, I've left the community. Sorry. And but so nowadays I actually push back on that and I say, for what? I put on a blue shirt instead of a white shirt and boom. Really what's happening is the community pushes you out more so than you leave. It's not so much you leaving. Who wants to leave? Who wants to cut off ties with their family just because they decided to trim their beard or their payas? Who wants to cut off ties with their family and community just because they want to be able to express themselves differently in their clothing? Nobody wants that. Obviously, you're being pushed out. So I say, I grew up Hasidic. I have the scars to show for it, right? At least with regards to not having an education. And now when I become inconvenient to you, I become outspoken about the ills, the systemic problems. You're like, you're out? No, you don't get to do that. So I am actually not sure, to answer your question, I don't have an identity. That's one of the biggest problems. I go to different synagogues and I don't feel like I fit in anywhere. obviously not in the Hasidic synagogues, but not even, modern Orthodox, Reform, Conservative. I've tested a bunch of them. And that's a painful kind of realization, to realize that, we don't fit in. And this benefits the Hasidic leadership, because they want to make it so that you do not fit in. You try to leave, you won't fit in. You'll become depressed. You'll become, suicidal, and then you'll serve as a warning to anyone else who wants to go in your footsteps, right? So you've probably read about some of this in the books, like Unorthodox, Unchosen, and All Who Go Do Not Return, and things like that. So yeah, the answer is we don't have a particular identity. I mean, I do consider myself kind of like a humanist, and of course, I am proudly Jewish, and as you know, my work is very much involved with both the ultra-Orthodox community as well as the broader Jewish community. But that's pretty much it. There's no real strong identity, to be honest.
Mhm. Do you have practices that are part of what is called Judaism and the Jewish religion that are significant to you, and that maybe you raise your children, you plan your children, your children will have Jewish identity? Will they grow up practicing the Jewish religion, or
Well,
bar mitzvah and things like that?
again, it's hard to tell, because different people consider practicing differently. My wife, my children are so small. My oldest of the two is 4, and my wife, since he was 3, reads to him some of the Torah parsha, but she reads it more like some of the other books that he has, which are all like, magical. And so in that context, it's funny when I hear my wife reading those stories, suddenly I'm like, wow, that's a great children's book. It's like the imagination, that you can employ is quite interesting. And he could sit there for hours listening to what used to be for me a painful experience in yeshiva, learning this stuff, right? We do Shabbat, meals. We often, participate in similar kind of, musical / prayer things, mostly or kid oriented. As he's growing up, we're, trying to like think if we can afford something like a Jewish camp, Jewish school. It's very expensive, we're discovering. So, so that is part of the problem, is like, not only for ourselves, but like not knowing exactly how much of it we want to give our kid without making it dogmatic and problematic. So we'll see.
Do you have what you consider to be, uh, many people talk about Jewish values, and a transmission that comes through the people of Jewish ancestry that has a mission or a sense of purpose in the world? Is that, do you feel like, for one, that that's part of what moves you to do the work that you do? And do you feel that's something that you're inculcating in your family and with your children, specifically naming it as Jewish values or Jewish teaching?
So, in my opinion, Jewish values can mean anything, and everyone tries to find. You could find anything in some of the Jewish texts somewhere, and and basically use it to your advantage. So, for instance, there are female Reform rabbis in the Jewish community who will quote certain parts of the Torah that they'll portray as mercy. Let's say, you should separate the mother from the child before you take the child away to, like I'm talking about like a bird or something. Um, in the Hasidic world, it's not actually put that way. It's more like a mitzvah. Even if you come across a nest that you have no intention of using the eggs or the birds, suddenly you have a mitzvah of sending the mother away and taking the eggs away. It's just a mitzvah. That's one example. But like similarly, like you see it a lot with, like, let's say when Trump was president, progressive Jews, Reform Jews, and conservative Jews were using various verses from the Torah to say, the Torah says you should care about the poor, the hungry, the immigrant, and then ultra-Orthodox or the right wing would use other parts to justify their actions. So, and unfortunately, in my opinion, this is true for a lot of religion. I mean, you can see in the Islamic world, people swear it's the religion of peace. And then there are others who use the same religion to conduct violence. So it's hard to necessarily make it about religion, in my opinion. But that being said, yeah, I could, when necessary, I point out to the various parts of repairing the world, the following the laws of the land, or the obligation to teach your son a trade, things like that. I pull from the Jewish religion as well, but I'm also pretty cognizant that unfortunately there's a lot of good in there and a lot of bad.
Sure.
So
Well,
yeah.
that kind of brings me to one last area that I wanted to ask you about, if you would respond. That is Israel. You mentioned that in your childhood, every Hasidic child is sent to Israel, and there's a lot of education there. And I have no doubt that, there was a strong identification with the righteousness of Israel and its history and its in battle with the Arab populations around it and in it. Has your association with Israel, has your feelings about Israel shifted along with the change in understanding that you've had about the Hasidic world itself?
Oh, absolutely. I remember as I was going through my transition, I remember sitting with a relative of mine. I'm not going to name or even tell you what relationship, a relatively close relative, and he was saying basically, you should wipe the Arabs off out of Israel into the sea, whatever, like the full, you can't deal with them. Kahana Chai, Kahana Tzedek, whatever, the Kahanist approach of just totally obliterating them is the correct way and things like that. And I don't think he even realized, but I was suddenly seeing myself as a Palestinian in Gaza or whatever who may not agree with the leadership, right? Because I was suddenly realizing, I was still looking Hasidic and everything, and I no longer felt like I was connected. And I thought to myself, this must be true for so many innocent people who are part of this system that may be terrible, but they are individuals who are not seeking to participate in any of that. And I basically challenged him on that. And I said, I'm sure there are some good ones. And he's like, oh, next thing you'll tell me is that there were some good Nazis, and without thinking, I was like, yes, I'm sure there were. And they just had to, they had to do. And I almost got my meal on my face when I said that. It was probably, just not the best idea to go there. But I definitely had a completely different realization. When we were in yeshiva, you have to understand, the Hasidic community is not Zionist for the most part. We are pro-Israel, mostly because we believe that it's our country and all of that, and also because we have too much connection there. Either, like I said, my own yeshiva, I used to be there, and I used to myself be afraid of, terrorism, of course, or we have relatives there, because I had two siblings who lived there because they married girls from Israel and things like that. So we feel very strongly like that. And then we are also taught to dehumanize everyone that is not Jewish, particularly, the Arabs who hate us so much. So that definitely isn't helpful. So yeah, upon my own transition, all of that was slowly being unlearned, and a new realization came to light. And, it's still complex. I don't claim to have the answers to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But at this point, I do know that, unfortunately, both sides are taught to hate each other. It's not just, a one-sided thing. And we need the more tolerant ones to gain dominance or prominence. and be able to spread peace.
Well, it seems to me that in my own life and in talking to many people who have crossed boundaries, significant boundaries of identification and what sense they have of their community, that empathy for people that come from other backgrounds, your ability to understand what a Palestinian might think or feel, would come about from the kind of change you yourself had to go through in relationship to your the hierarchy and authority figures that were in your community.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I feel a little bit bad. I feel wonderful about the conversation we've had. I'm really happy to have you have shared so much of your story from the inside. I feel bad that I promised you we would get to Yaffed, and I promise that when I forward this interview, I will include material about it, but let me give you as much time as you want to take right now to tell people about Yaffed and your work with that. And yeah, because I know it's wonderful work. I admire you for it. You're a dedicated, courageous individual, and you've come under serious attack for some of the work that you've done, as well as been awarded and recognized for your work. So
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it.
tell
So,
us about
I
Yaffed.
mean, yeah, so I touched upon it from kind of like my personal experience, but the kind of education that I received or did not receive really is pretty common in the Hasidic world. So basically, children under the age 13 or in elementary and middle school receive approximately 90 minutes of secular education a day. It happens at the end of the school day, more like an after school program. It's not taken seriously, and it usually just consists of basic English and arithmetic. And then once we reached high school, we would get cut off completely from secular education. I forgot to say this is not for all children; it's more for the boys. The girls, ironically, tend to get a better education because they are prohibited from studying the Judaic studies that we study, most of it, and they can't become rabbis, which each of us are basically groomed and destined to be. So they get a better education. It's mainly the boys that don't. Um, so and and so when I came out of the system, I discovered the tremendous gaps in my education. Sorry, I discovered the tremendous gaps in my education, and I began, looking into it and discovering that there are laws in place that require non-public schools in New York to provide a basic secular education. They call it a substantially equivalent education. And obviously that hasn't been enforced, right? The fact that we would barely learn English and arithmetic, definitely no science or social studies, is clear that they weren't meeting this requirement. So yes, I began organizing it around it, and we're unfortunately almost 9 years later, we're still fighting for something as simple as ensuring that all kids get a basic education should be enforced properly. We count on the broader society and especially Jews outside of the ultra-Orthodox community to support us and to help us urge the state and the local districts to enforce it. Because frankly, the way things are going, the fastest growing Jewish population is the Hasidic community. And the way things are going in a decade or two, the face of the Jewish people in New York, as is the case in Israel, will be that of illiteracy, poverty, dependence on government assistance, disconnected from the world. Basically, everything that the exact opposite of what we think about now when we think about the Jew, an average New York Jew, right? So I think this is something that should concern, the broader public, and we need assistance. It's not normal that it should be so hard to ensure kids learn basic English, math, science, and social studies. So that's it in a nutshell.
Right.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. And you're right, we do have to end soon.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Naftuli. And those who want more information about Yaffed, it's yaffed.org, yaffed.org.
Yep.
And thank you for listening. And we will close here. Thanks again, Naftuli.
Thank you so